Good morning. Time to begin. We're in class 9. I think there's some copies that I left on the back. If anyone needs a copy, we can get those. If you'll just raise your hand, we'll get copies of them. Guess everybody's good. Going to talk about Jesus and his fourth Passover and the last week before his crucifixion. But in order to do that, I wanted to take just a minute and kind of summarize where I think we are right now based upon what I've come to the conclusion about. Doesn't mean it's necessarily right, but it means what I'm comfortable with. So you need to get that way yourself. But back in John the 6th chapter, we find the third Passover that Jesus attends. And then in chapter 7, beginning in verse 2, says, "Now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand." So Jesus has gone from the third Passover back to Galilee, and when the Feast of Tabernacles is approaching, that would be in the September time frame, in the fall. And so his John the 7th chapter, verse 3 says, "His brothers therefore said to him, 'Depart from here and go into Judea, that your disciples may also see the works that you are doing.'" Then look at verse 5, says, "For not even his brothers believed in him." I think he's talking about his fleshly brothers here, his half-brothers. John doesn't get specific about who these brothers are, but they were having a problem and they wanted Jesus to go to the Feast of Tabernacles. But verse 1 of chapter 7 says, "After these things Jesus walked in Galilee, for he did not want to walk in Judea because the Jews sought to kill him." And so opposition to him has been building through a lot of the things that have taken place after he started his earthly ministry. The number of people that are following Jesus has become a concern for the Jewish leadership, and so they're having some problems with that. And so Jesus has been staying out of Judea, out of that area for a good portion of the time. But then this Feast of Tabernacles comes up. It was one of the 3 yearly feasts that the Jews were required to attend in Jerusalem. And Jesus says his time has not yet come concerning this. In verse 6, then Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always ready." In other words, okay for you to go. It's all right for you, but it's not good for me to go at this time. But then he goes up secretly later on to the feast. And after a period of time that he's been there, he begins to publicly teach in the temple. And he's going about this for some period of time. And as you read on down through chapter 7, the high priest and the Pharisees send out a detachment to arrest him and bring him before the Sanhedrin. And when they come back, they say they didn't have him. And so the question is asked, well, why didn't you arrest him? And they say no one ever taught like he he teaches. There was just a distinction that they recognized in how Jesus taught, and so they didn't arrest him. And there is some discussion about look at about verse 45. Then the officers came to the chief priests and Pharisees, who said to them, "Why have you not brought him?" In other words, we sent you out to bring him here before us. Verse 46, the officers answered, "No man ever spoke like this man." Then the Pharisees answered, "Are you also deceived?" So this was their attitude toward those who were following Jesus. Have any of the rulers of the Pharisees believed in him? That was not truly an accurate statement, was it? Because later on we're going to see that a number of the priests, at least, believed in Jesus. They didn't confess him because they would have been cast out of the synagogue, and that would have been something that it just says they love the praise of men greater than the praise of God. But verse 49 says, "But this crowd that does not know the law is accursed." Nicodemus, he came to Jesus by night. You remember, Nicodemus has come to Jesus when he was at the first Passover. And he came to him kind of secretly. But here he is a member of the Sanhedrin now. In other passages, he is identified as a ruler, as a teacher. He was a prominent man among the Jewish hierarchy, and apparently was a member of the Sanhedrin. And so he defends Jesus in this case. And so as you go down through chapter 8 then of John, it seems that Jesus stayed in the area of Jerusalem for some period of time until the Feast of Dedication, which was in December. So probably from like late September, Feast of Tabernacles, he stayed until December time frame in that area teaching. And as you read down through chapter 8 all the way down through chapter 8, chapter 9, and chapter 10 through about verse 21, there's a lot of things that he is discussing about who he is, his crucifixion, his approaching death, and the things that they need to be aware of. So because of a lot of what is going on at this period of time, and he is spending a lot of time in Jerusalem teaching the people and gaining more and more followers, the Jews are increasing their efforts to arrest him, to bring him before the Sanhedrin. And as a result of that, in chapter 10 and verse 40 of John, the book Gospel of John, John says that he retreats from there. Let's go over and look at chapter 10 and verse 40. Says, "And he went away again beyond the Jordan to the place where John was baptizing at first, and there he stayed." So this would be an area probably in Perea, which would have been on the west side of the Jordan River. It was about some 30 miles or so from Jerusalem where he would be. But as John records, it's just a place where John was baptizing at first. And this seems to be where he was when he gets word that Lazarus is sick. that he is in that area. And so he remains there a couple of days even after that. It would take about 2 days of travel to get back to Jerusalem. And so he goes to Bethany. He leaves that area. He goes to Bethany. He raises Lazarus from the dead. And that's what we see as we go through the remainder of chapter 10 and then into chapter 11 of John. Then look at John the 11th chapter and verse 54. Says, therefore Jesus no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went away from them into the country near the wilderness to a city called Ephraim, and there remained with his disciples. Ephraim is north of Jerusalem, approximately 30 miles or so, somewhere in that area. And so as a result of the things that he does in raising Lazarus from the dead, the Jews' pressure to arrest him just continues to increase. And as a result, he kind of gets out of that area and goes a little further to the north. And then in chapter 11 and verse 55 says, and the Passover of the Jews was near. Seems to me this is the fourth Passover that he is going to attend. And read on down through verse 45. And many went up from the country up to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. You will find as you read different commentators, different views on this, but some of them use the idea that there was a period of time that people would go up early to Jerusalem to make sure that they were ceremonially pure in order to participate in some of the feasts that were going on at that time. And in fact, if you go back to Exodus, that's kind of what you see being instructed there, that the people become, they need to purify themselves in order to participate in certain things. And so some commentators I've read take the position that this was probably maybe a couple of weeks before the Passover started in Jerusalem. And so the Passover was near, and Jesus had left Bethany, left that area, and gone to Perea, which was up north, or gone to Ephraim, which was up north. And that would have been in late December, first part of the year, what we might consider January, sometime in that time frame. And it seems that he stayed there until the Passover, which was, April? About April time frame. Then he came back down to Jerusalem to the Passover. So he's in Jerusalem now, and this is his fourth Passover. And we begin looking at the final week of his life before he is arrested and brought before the court and tried and crucified. And so John says in John 11, verse 56, people were wondering if Jesus was going to come to the Passover. It would probably be a normal reaction of people thinking about all that's going on, the pressure that the Jewish leadership is putting on him, the word that they have put out, if anybody knows anything about him. They were to be informed that they might seize him. And so that's probably a normal reaction of people. Do you think he's really going to come and subject himself to that? Look at John 11, verse 57. Now both the chief priests and the Pharisees had given a command that if anyone knew where he was, he should report it so that they might seize him. So there's essentially a contract put out on him by the Jewish leadership, and they wanted to know when he was in the area. Now Jesus, in verse 1 of chapter 12 says, then 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany. So he comes from Ephraim, and he goes back to Bethany, to Mary and Martha's and Lazarus, where they lived, and appears to stay with them during this 6 days. John records that Mary washed his feet at that time. You remember she used some expensive oil. What was Judas's reaction to that? It's a waste of money. Why would Judas, Judas talked about all that could be done for the poor and all of that, but John just very plainly says Judas was a thief. He kept the money box, and it was just kind of his bank account, seemed like. He just took out of the money box whenever he needed it. So these things are going on at that time. In chapter 12 and verse 7, Jesus talks about his burial relative to Mary washing his feet. He says, let her alone. She has kept this for the day of my burial. And so Jesus is trying to prepare these people as much as possible for the things that are going to take place in just a very few days. And they're having difficulty understanding this. He says in verse 8 of John 12, for the poor you have with you always, but me you do not have always. Now, they were having some difficulty understanding this, but he continued to try to instruct them, try to get them to understand. This even gets to the point that, as John points out in verses 10 and 11, the chief priests took counsel that they might also put Lazarus to death. Why did they want to kill Lazarus?
He was literally a living witness to Jesus' power.
All right, he was, a lot of the people were following Jesus because of what he had done for Lazarus. Now, a lot of the people saw they were witness to the raising of Lazarus, and so just because Lazarus was alive, that was a motivation for a lot of people to follow Jesus, and the leadership were having trouble with that. And so they were trying to kill Lazarus as well as Jesus. They were just going to get rid of everything that was taking people away from them, drawing people away from them. In verses 42 and 43 of John 12, John says that many of the rulers believed in him but would not confess him, for they loved the praise of men. They feared the Pharisees, what the Pharisees would do to them. So there's this whole thing going on here. There is this battle, it seems, among a lot of the people between the old law and what was required of them and how they dealt with that in all aspects of their life. You see, it wasn't only just their spiritual life relative to the law, but it was their social and economic life as well. And so they had difficulty, some of them, in dealing with that. And that's particularly true about these priests and rulers. In chapter 12, Jesus also talks about being the light of the world. He says, I've come to bring light. And his point is, you cannot walk in darkness. You know, it kind of reminds you of 1 John 1. 1 John 1, John says, if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another. It's the only way we can have fellowship with God, but it's the only way we can have fellowship with one another is by walking in the light, because God is light and there is no darkness in him. He also talks about he does not speak on his own authority. In John the 12th chapter, where is it, about verse 47, he says, if you reject the words that I speak, what do you have that judge you? His words, right? And so he's speaking based upon what has been given to him by the Father. He says it's not just what I'm speaking based on my own authority, but it's what has been given to me by the Father. And if you reject that, that's what's going to judge you in the last days. So you need to pay attention to what it requires of you. Then all four of the Gospels talk about the Passover feast that Jesus eats. Matthew 20, Mark 10, John the 12th chapter. And during this period of time, what else does Jesus do? All right, he gives them instruction concerning the Lord's Supper. And if you go over to 1 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, the Apostle Paul talks about this, that the Lord gave these instructions concerning the unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine and the eating of that. Now, Jesus tell you how often to do it? No, he didn't, did he? He just said, how do you know that we need to partake of this every first day of the week?
Well, we have an example in Acts 27.
Right, we have an example of the disciples when they came together on the first day of the week to do that very thing, to partake of the Lord's Supper. And so that's the authority that we have for doing it every week, is we have an example of what the first century Christians did and how they followed up with what Jesus instructed them to do, or instructed his apostles at the Passover feast before his crucifixion. What else did Jesus do at this Passover feast? A couple of things.
Identified Judas.
All right. He identified Judas as the one that would betray him. He also talks about Peter and the denial of not only Peter but all of the apostles, that they would essentially deny him. In other words, they would leave. And that's kind of what we find, isn't it? Is that John seems to be the only one that has kind of stuck around through this process of Jesus' crucifixion and trial. But Peter says he never would deny Christ, that even if he had to die, he wouldn't deny Christ. And Jesus tells him, before the cock crows, you'll deny me 3 times. And so we're going to see that play out as we go on down through this. Then they leave the Passover feast and they go across the brook of Kidron, it says, to the Garden of Gethsemane. Did Judas know where they were going? Yeah. John says that Judas was familiar with this place because they had often gone there. Jesus with his disciples had often gone there. And so Judas knew where they would be. Now, yes, Joe.
I have a question. It says in Luke's version there that Jesus prayed that Peter would be strong. But he knew that what he was going to do. But he still prayed for it.
Well, he also, where is it that he talks about Satan has asked for you? And so he knew, I think he knew the events that were going to take place. And I think to pray for Peter to be strong, even though he knew Peter was going to deny him, we pray for one another just like in, I think in Acts, the 4th chapter, there was a prayer offered after Peter and some had come from the Sanhedrin, and they prayed that they might have boldness to continue to preach the gospel. And it just seems to me that praying for someone to be strong, even though you might have the ability to know what they're going through and how they're going to react, it would still be something that would be valid to pray for. Yes?
I think the other thing is that Jesus knows that Judas is going to commit suicide. And so you've got Judas who's committing suicide for betrayal, and you've got Peter who's denied 3 times. It may not be too much of a leap for Peter to wonder, should I take the same fate or
Yeah.
deny my Lord? And so reminding him to be strong may have resonated while he's processing the loss of not only his Lord, but a companion.
It's a good point. When you look at the reaction of Judas and Peter, who were guilty of basically the same thing, how one reacted versus the other. Ron?
Well, it's also possible that the Lord knew that this betrayal was going to happen, but what followed that with Judas or with Peter basically restoring back to the faith that he had, and then strength through the whole process of persecution and all of that over the years, and ultimately his death that would take place for Peter to be strong during those subsequent years, perhaps.
Do you have something, Jerry?
Yeah, I think the prayer is not that he'll all of a sudden get some fortitude and not deny him 3 times. The prayer is, as she said, I think too, that it doesn't destroy you.
Yeah.
That your faith not fail. He's going to have a crisis of weak faith. I think Jesus is saying there, I'm praying for you that it not totally destroy your faith.
And I think, when you look at all the things that Peter and the rest of the apostles went through after Jesus' death, there was going to be some strength needed on their part. Even if you go over to Galatians and you look at what Paul says about Peter relative to the Jews and the Gentiles, he said, I had to confront him to the face that he had withdrawn from the Gentiles because the Jews had come, the pressure of the Jews. So there was some strength needed, and that would have been 20, 30 years possibly after Christ was crucified. And Peter still had moments when he kind of had shortcomings even during that period of time that he needed some strength to continue to hold fast. Jerry?
Yeah, what Jesus said right before he said, I'm praying for you, he said, Satan's asked for you. The reason he's asked for you is that he can sift you as wheat. And that sifting process was to, what went into the sifter, everything good fell out
With
and left nothing but bad. He said, that's what Satan wants to do to you. He wants to sift every bit of good out of you to leave nothing but worthless. He said, that's what Satan's wanting. What I'm praying for is that doesn't happen.
All right, anyone else? Yes.
Is it not true that the almost because there's that comfort he has with him there, we still don't understand. They still didn't fully understand the ramifications. But
I've-
something that from the human standpoint, just not having that comfort.
I think if we're all honest with ourselves, we have ups and downs in our life as Christians. I certainly have. I suspect most of us have, if we're really objective with ourselves, that there's been times when we've not done things that we should have done or done things that we shouldn't have done. And that's a little bit, I think, of what's happening to Peter here. Yeah, Marie?
It referred me back to Job. Satan asked for Job. He's sick, he's sick, he's sick.
Yeah.
And he's doing the same thing to Peter. That's kind of like what I associated.
Job held up a little better than Peter did through that process, but
The interesting thing is with Job and Peter, Satan had to ask permission.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's why we always need to keep in mind is that Satan doesn't have absolute control to just do whatever he wants to do. But here's the other thing that you need to think about with Peter that has always been kind of interesting to me as you read through those accounts of when Jesus is arrested. We'll get back to that in just a minute. But when Jesus is arrested and he's taken before the high priest that night, what does Peter do? He warms himself by a fire that was built, and he puts himself in a circumstance that contributed to his denial, right?
He made choices.
He made choices. The rest of them seemed to kind of left, all but one that was not, he's not named, but I think it was John. John was someone that was familiar with some of the people there in the area, apparently. And he got Peter in, but Peter voluntarily put himself in an environment that was not conducive to him being strong. We do that sometimes, don't we? We may not be thinking clearly, and we may allow ourselves to get into an environment that is not conducive to conducting ourselves as we should. And I think we have to be careful of that. But what I want us to go back and look at is in John 18, beginning in verse 4, Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them. Now, this is when Judas and the contingent of people come out to arrest him. And there's a whole group of them. Says, whom are you seeking? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said to them, I am he. Now, here's what I want us to think about. And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Now when he said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. Why? I mean, we're not told how many there were, but there was a big crowd of people that came with Judas to arrest him. They weren't taking chances about him getting away as he had done in the past. And here was Jesus with just the 11 there in the garden. And all Jesus answers their question when they ask, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. And he said, I'm he. And they just all fall to the ground. Jerry?
It's almost like they're conscripted. This is not their idea. They were soldiers of the high priest, and they were told to do something, so they had to go do it. But
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like that they were real eager about this. They knew the kind of power they were standing in.
Yeah. When he says, I am he, any other times when he says, I am? Pardon? Yeah. I am the light, I am the good shepherd, and so forth, and you find it, but what else might that imply to someone? Remember back in Exodus when God was sending Moses to free the children of Israel, and Moses said, when I tell the children of Israel and they ask, who sent you? Who am I going to tell them sent me? And what is God's reply? Tell them I am who I am. And it always has seemed to me that one aspect of this might be, and I think Jerry's probably right in that these were not Roman soldiers. These were people that the Sanhedrin had more or less forced to go out and arrest him. But at the same time, when he says, I am, what might the normal Jew recognize by I am? What he's saying is, I'm God. Joe?
So is that falling backwards, not just falling backwards, but stepping back and bowing when he identified himself as I am?
I don't know. It just says they fell to the ground. I don't know what position they were in, flat on their back or on their face. I don't.
But, I guess a lot of people, when they came in contact with angels, quickly fell to the ground.
Some say they feared Jesus' authority. They were afraid they were about to arrest the divine person.
Ron?
The other times that people had come out to arrest Jesus, he was gone.
Yeah.
This time, he's not gone.
And he's not attempting to go.
They knew he had the ability to do some, you know, very unusual things, miraculous things. And now, you know, they kind of, to borrow a phrase, they have a cat by the tail. And perhaps they did not know what was about to happen whenever he does not just vanish.
Yeah. Well, on top of that, what did Peter do? Peter drew a sword that he had and cut off the ear of a fella. John, I think, is the only one that tells us who that fellow was. It was a servant of the high priest. His name was Malchus. And Luke is, I think Luke is the only one that says Jesus touched his ear and healed him. If you were in the crowd that gone out to arrest a fella and somebody cut off someone's ear and this guy picks it up, puts it back on, and you would be you would kind of step back and think, yeah, who are we dealing with here, you know? Anyway, any other comments? Our time is just about gone this morning. Joe?
Say in essence, Jesus gave them permission to take him. Until they were very firm that they had that permission, they didn't bind him and take him away.
Yeah, they had been sent out to do this, and so next time, Lord willing, we're going to look at the trial, which there's some legal aspects to the trial of Jesus, and then his crucifixion. We will deal with that some in our lesson next week. Appreciate all of your comments. Good thoughts. Thank you.